In this lesson, we are going to talk about HTTP status codes. So let's understand what are the status codes first. So as the HTTP status code is used to help the client, like the user or the system submitting data to the server, like us submitting some data to an API, to understand what happened on server-side application. The status codes, like they are international standards on how the client-server interaction should handle the result of a request, and it allows everyone to send the request to know if their submission in the end was successful or not, or we get some errors or stuff. So let's understand first what types of status codes there are. So there are 5 types of status codes, start with starting index from 1 to 5, and they have like usually 3 letters. It's for the one and some numbers. It's about information response. It's the request processing, so it's still in the process. The status codes which start with 2 are success status codes. It means that the request was successfully complete. The status codes that start with 3 are about redirection. The further action must be complete. The other type, which is starting from 4, number 4, is about the client errors. An error was caused by the client. It means we have used something wrong in our code when accessing the API. And the final one is 5xx5 and some 2 numbers, which means server errors. So when an error occurred on the server side, so something is wrong with the API or with the instance we are working. We are going to explore mainly the status codes from starting with 2, with 4 and 5. And let's first go deep into understand what does the successful status codes mean, starting with number 2. The first status code, the most famous one, is status code 200, which means standard response for a successful request. So it's used when we are, like, let's say, getting something from the API and eventually the data is being returned and everything went successful with no major errors. The second one is 201. This means that the request was successful and a new resource is being created. Is used whenever we use the post request. And when you use the post request, we usually add something to the data, and we have the request body. So this is mainly used the 201 with the post request when we post and we post creating an entity. And this final one for the 200 request are the 204. This request is successful, is again from the successful part, and it did not create an entity, it did not return anything. It's commonly used just for the put requests. And the second type of request we will go through are the 5xx server status codes. So they represent some internal server errors. It's like general error message when an unexpected issue happened on the server side. You need to go and check what is happening in the server side with the logs and something. The final ones are the 4xx client error status codes. So the first one is 400, which means bad. It means that the current process request due to the client error is commonly used for invalid request methods. Let's say when you in the request method specify like a wrong JSON format and that the API request, it might get to some client errors, which means you have provided the wrong request body format. The second one is 401 unauthorized, which means you don't have access and authentication and authorization to target some resource in the API. The other one is 404, which means that the client request resource cannot be found. And the final one is 422, it's unprocessable entity, which means some semantic errors in the client request. So in short, to summarize everything, like 100 and above are for information. You rarely will use them directly. The 200 and 201, 204 are all for the successful request. For 204 there is no content. This response is used when there is no content to return to the client. 200 is for all when everything went successful, especially let's say for the get request, and 201 is for the created when we use the post request. The 300 are for the redirection with responses with the status code. may or may not have a body except for 304. So we'll not go deep into this 300. If you want, you can just use some additional materials to go deep into the 300 status and codes. The 400 are all regarding the client errors, and the status codes starting with 5 are all from the server errors. So something happening with the server, when something goes wrong with your application code or server, it will automatically return one of the status codes. Let's go to practice a little bit and understand in which cases we can use the HTTP status codes. We are going to use again the example of our books project. So let's understand first a simple example, and then we'll go and use in the books project our example more thoroughly. So we have the app equals to fast API instance. So we have the get request, the hello, giving us just hello world, and we have the get block with ID put the dynamic path parameter, and we are saying that we want the status code to be status.http 200 OK, and we say here that if the ID is greater than 5, the response status code must be HTTP 404 not found, and just return that error message saying that the block with this ID is not found, and else we just set the response status code to 200, saying that okay, this is the key message with the block with the ID is found, and just print this and return this to the client. This is one of the examples we can use the status codes. Let's now go back to our famous books project. As we remember, we have the book class, we have all the class attributes for this book, we have the ID, title, author, description, rating, and published date, we have the pydantic validation, we have this sample example of how to add some data to our database, we have the book sample data, and then we have the requests, the get requests for the books, getting the book by book ID, returning all the books, publishing some book, creating a new book, and updating a book, and then eventually deleting a book. So let's add some functionalities on some endpoints with some HTTP status codes. So the first one is when we're getting the books, we should return in the end an HTTP status code of 200, where everything went successful, when we're able to get the list of all the books. The other one is to get the books by ID. So it will say that the status code is 200, but if we couldn't find the book in the books, we will raise an HTTP exception with status code 404, so that item is not found in the books database. The other one is the books to get by the books rating. So we are going to set this as just status code of 200. It will return either no books or a couple of books depending on the rating we have specified in the query parameter here. The next one is the publish, which we are just publishing a book as a get request. So we just in this case also need only the HTTP 200 status code. The next one is the post request when we are creating a book. So in this case, we need to return a status code of 201 HTTP 201 created, as you remember from the theory part. So now we are using here the status code equal to status HTTP 201 just created. And in the case of the put request, we are for the successful request, we need to return that HTTP 204 no content. And if nothing is changed in the database, we need to raise an HTTP exception saying the status code is 404 now, and the detail that the item is not found. So this is a very illustrative example where we can use the 204 and 404. And the final one, in this case, the delete one. And when we are deleting some book, so we need to, of course, if everything went successful, we need to return HTTP again 204 with no content. And again, if we go with these books and we didn't find the book ID and we didn't delete anything, so in the database there is no book changed, so we need to again raise an HTTP exception of state and return a status code 404 and say that the details are that the item is not found. So this is it for the HTTP status codes.